When the Second World War began reshaping Europe in 1939, Denmark was a quiet, peaceful nation that never imagined it would soon stand at the center of one of the most extraordinary moral stories of the war. For months, Danish newspapers carried reports about Germany's sudden attacks across Europe, Poland crushed in weeks, Norway under threat, France collapsing with unbelievable speed. As the German blitzkrieg swept across one country after another, the Danish government and people watched with growing anxiety, knowing very well that their own army was too small and too lightly equipped to resist a German invasion if one ever came. That fear turned into reality on the morning of April 9, 1940, when German troops crossed the Danish border and warplanes circled above Copenhagen. The invasion was so swift that before most citizens had finished breakfast, Denmark was effectively surrounded. Realizing that resistance would lead only to unnecessary bloodshed and destruction, the Danish government made a painful but pragmatic decision to surrender within hours, hoping to preserve the lives of its people and avoid the fate that had already befallen so many European nations. The German occupation of Denmark, however, turned out to be very different from the brutal systems imposed elsewhere. Hitler believed that Danes were racially acceptable, and, more importantly, Germany needed Danish farms and industries to continue running smoothly. Denmark provided food, agricultural products, and access to strategic waterways. Therefore, the Germans adopted what they called a model protectorate. The Danish government was allowed to remain in place, the police continued their work, the courts functioned normally, and Danish flags still flew over public buildings. Citizens could attend school, shops stayed open, and daily life, at least on the surface, looked strikingly normal. This unusual arrangement created an atmosphere of uneasy calm. People knew that German soldiers were watching, but they also sensed that Denmark was not being crushed the way Poland, the Netherlands, or Belgium had been. And perhaps the most remarkable part of these early years was that the Jewish population, around 7,800 people, remained completely safe. They were not forced to wear yellow stars, not pushed into ghettos, not banned from public spaces. They continued working as doctors, teachers, shopkeepers, lawyers, and neighbors. They were, in every sense, a natural part of Danish society. But beneath this calm surface lay growing tension, because Danes were not blind to what was happening elsewhere. They heard news of the ghettos in Poland, of the mass shootings in Eastern Europe, of the death camps that were being whispered about through refugee accounts. They read foreign newspapers when they could get them, and listened secretly to BBC broadcasts despite German restrictions. While they lived under a relatively mild occupation, they knew that the same Nazi regime responsible for their mild treatment was responsible for unimaginable horrors in other places. This contradiction disturbed many Danes, and while they did not revolt openly, small acts of resistance gradually began taking shape: underground newspapers, anti-German graffiti, and quiet refusal to cooperate with certain German demands. The Danish government tried to walk a delicate line, keeping its people safe without provoking German anger, but such balance could not last forever. By 1943, the war had turned dramatically against Germany. The defeat at Stalingrad shattered the myth of German invincibility. Allied bombing campaigns intensified, German supply lines were strained, and occupied countries everywhere became more defiant. Denmark, too, saw increasing unrest. Sabotage operations began targeting factories that worked for the German war effort. Railway lines were disrupted. Public strikes gained momentum. Young Danes joined underground resistance groups. The Danish government, which had once cooperated cautiously, now resisted openly. The Germans had tolerated Denmark's semi-independence as long as the country remained quiet and useful, but the moment Denmark began pushing back, Berlin decided the time for leniency was over. On August 29, 1943, German authorities dissolved the Danish government, declared martial law, and placed the country under direct military control. The Danish Navy sank many of its own ships to prevent German seizure, resistance groups intensified their attacks, and a dark cloud of uncertainty settled over the country. The Germans now intended to bring Denmark into full alignment with Nazi racial policy, and that meant dealing with the Jews. Hitler's officials prepared a secret operation to arrest every Jew in Denmark on a single night. Most Danish Jews had no idea this was coming. After 3 years of relative safety, many believed they would remain untouched. But history was about to take a dramatic turn. A German official named George Ferdinand Duckwitz, who had grown sympathetic toward Denmark and deeply disliked the idea of sending innocent people to their deaths, learned about the upcoming mass arrest. Shocked and morally torn, he made a dangerous choice. Instead of keeping the secret, he attempted to sabotage the plan. He first traveled to Sweden to ask its government whether it would accept Jewish refugees if they managed to escape across the sea. Sweden agreed. Then Duckwitz returned to Denmark and secretly warned key Danish politicians about the impending operation. The news spread through political, social, and religious networks with astonishing speed. Doctors whispered warnings to their Jewish patients. Teachers sent messages through students. Pastors walked quietly from house to house. University students rode bicycles late into the night, knocking on doors, telling families to leave immediately. In a matter of hours, Denmark moved from calm acceptance to quiet, urgent action. People helped hide Jewish neighbors in basements, attics, barns, hospitals, and summer cottages. They handed over old clothes, extra blankets, and food. They tore up official papers, altered medical records, and removed names from public lists. Entire towns seemed to shift into a different rhythm, one defined not by fear alone but by determination. As the German plan approached, the atmosphere across Denmark thickened with anxiety. Jewish families packed small bags, often taking nothing but documents, a little money, and a few treasured items. Parents struggled to calm their children, unsure whether they would reach safety or be captured. Danish civilians who had never broken a law in their lives now found themselves lying to soldiers, forging documents, and guiding strangers along back roads under the cover of night. The rescue had not yet begun in full, but its foundation built on shared humanity and an extraordinary spirit of collective courage was already in place. This moment, suspended between danger and hope, marked the beginning of one of the most remarkable rescue operations of the entire war. Denmark was no longer just an occupied nation, it was about to become the stage for a moral triumph unlike anything Nazi Germany had expected. The warning spreads and a nation begins to move, 1080 words. The warning that Denmark's Jews were about to be arrested spread not through announcements or posters but through whispers, urgent, hushed, breathless whispers carried from one trusted person to another. The message was simple, terrifying, and immediate: the Germans are coming for the Jews on the night of October 1st. Leave your home at once. That single sentence traveled across Copenhagen and the surrounding towns like a shockwave. It moved through hospital corridors, behind shop counters, across university courtyards, inside church offices, and into ordinary family kitchens. People stopped whatever they were doing and began acting with a seriousness that turned ordinary citizens into secret rescuers within hours. For Danish Jews, the news felt unreal at first. For 3 years they had lived under an occupation that had treated them far more gently than in the rest of Europe. They had continued working in schools, businesses, medical clinics, and universities. Many had believed, or at least hoped, that Denmark's unique political situation would shield them from the fate that had already consumed so many Jews across the continent. The sudden warning shattered that illusion completely. Families were told they had no time to think, only minutes or hours to gather documents, money, and essentials before German soldiers would begin knocking on doors. Some households panicked, some packed in stunned silence, and some simply stood frozen for long moments, unable to believe that their lives had shifted so dramatically in a single afternoon. The first place many Jews turned to was their neighbors, because the strongest force in Denmark at that moment was not fear but solidarity. Danish neighbors, classmates, colleagues, and even distant acquaintances took it upon themselves to shield people they loved and people they barely knew. They opened their homes, cleared closets, emptied attics, and prepared spare rooms as hiding places. A schoolteacher hid an entire family behind a wall of books. A fisherman's wife stored children's clothing in her cupboard so she could disguise little ones quickly if German patrols appeared. In apartments across Copenhagen, families pushed furniture aside and laid mattresses on floors, preparing for unexpected guests. It was not a coordinated political plan, it was instinctive humanity, multiplied thousands of times over. Churches played a crucial role as well. Pastors, who had been quietly uneasy about German rule from the beginning, now understood that moral responsibility required action, not sermons. Although they could not openly announce the danger, they used coded language to alert their congregations and then moved discreetly from home to home, offering guidance and comfort. In some cases, rectories became temporary shelters. Hospital staff also acted with swift compassion. Nurses altered patient records so Jewish people admitted under false names would appear non-Jewish. Doctors diagnosed healthy families with contagious illnesses, placing quarantine signs on doors to keep German soldiers away. Medical equipment rooms became hiding spaces, and oxygen closets transformed into secret passageways. University students, many of whom were already part of small resistance groups, became the messengers and couriers of the rescue. They bicycled through dark streets with handwritten notes tucked inside shoes, coat sleeves, or bicycle handlebars. They traveled across cities and villages with maps in their heads, guiding Jewish families through back alleys and forest paths, avoiding German checkpoints that were growing stricter by the day. Riders memorized routes rather than carrying written instructions, knowing that if they were caught with incriminating papers, the consequences would be deadly. As nighttime fell, the urgency grew. Danish Jews began slipping out of their homes, some through front doors with lights off, others through windows or back exits carrying small bags and wearing layers of clothing in case they lost everything else. Many left behind furniture, books, photographs, and heirlooms that had been in their families for generations. They knew they might never see their homes again. Parents whispered instructions to their children, telling them not to cry or speak loudly. A few children carried dolls or stuffed animals for comfort, unaware of the danger in full but sensing the fear in their parents' voices. Safe houses soon filled up beyond capacity. In Copenhagen, some buildings sheltered more people than they had space for. Families slept on floors, under tables, inside broom closets, and in attics so cramped that adults could not stand upright. Volunteers brought bread, milk, and warm clothing late at night, avoiding the streets during times when German patrols were busiest. The entire country seemed to be moving quietly in the same direction, like hundreds of small rivers merging into one large, determined current. The next challenge was getting people out of the cities and toward the eastern coast, where Sweden lay only a short distance across the Øresund Strait. But reaching the water was far from simple. Roads leading to coastal towns were patrolled by German troops, and cars leaving Copenhagen were sometimes stopped for inspections. Danes who owned vehicles volunteered to drive Jewish families under the guise of routine trips transporting relatives, patients, or workers. Some drivers placed Jewish passengers on the floor of the car, covering them with blankets, luggage, or even stacks of vegetables to disguise the humans hidden underneath. Bicycles became one of the most reliable methods of movement. Students and workers pedaled through the night in groups of 2 or 3, escorting families along narrow paths that avoided main roads. At times, they had to ride without lights to avoid attracting attention, resulting in collisions, falls, and minor injuries. But they kept going. Even those who crashed simply got back up, dusted themselves off, and continued, because turning back was not an option. In small towns along the coast, especially in places like Gilleleje, Snekkerston, and Helsingør, locals mobilized quickly. Fishermen understood that their boats normally used for catching cod and herring were about to become lifelines. Before they could begin transporting anyone, they needed fuel, blankets, and information about German patrol patterns. They also needed time to modify their vessels. Some built false bottoms where people could hide, others added wooden crates to create makeshift compartments. Fishermen's wives prepared food packages, knitted woolen caps, and collected money from neighbors to cover the high cost of fuel, which was scarce due to wartime shortages. The closer it got to October 1st, the deeper the tension grew. Every hour seemed longer than the last. Denmark was still pretending to function normally on the surface, shops selling bread, trams clattering through streets, children walking to school, but underneath that quiet exterior, a nationwide rescue operation was taking shape, built entirely on trust and urgency. German soldiers, unaware of the full scale of what was happening, continued their patrols, but by then thousands of Jewish men, women, and children had already scattered into the protective arms of Danish society. By the time the final nights before the planned arrests arrived, it was clear that Denmark had undergone a transformation. It was no longer a country simply enduring occupation, it was a country preparing to defy the occupiers in one of the most humane acts of resistance the war would ever witness. The stage was set, the danger was imminent, and yet an entire people stood silently ready to do whatever it took to save their Jewish neighbors from the catastrophe approaching in the darkness. The sea crossings begin. As September 1943 drew to a close, the coastal towns of Denmark underwent a quiet transformation that only those deeply involved could sense. Streets that normally echoed with the casual rhythms of fishing lifeboats returning at dawn, nets being mended in courtyards, the smell of salt carried by the wind were now moving under a strange and tense heartbeat. Every whisper seemed weighted, every footstep measured. While the German occupation continued its daily routines, the Danes working along the shores were preparing for missions they had never imagined performing, guiding terrified families across the dark, unpredictable waters to Sweden, where safety awaited just beyond the horizon. The first nights of escape were filled with uncertainty. Jews hidden in safe houses were told to wait for a signal that could come at any moment. In fishermen's kitchens, maps of the strait were spread across wooden tables, lit by dim lamps carefully positioned so their glow wouldn't spill outside. Men bent over these maps with furrowed brows, debating which routes would have the fewest German patrols, which coves were safest for loading passengers, and which hours of the night offered the best chance of slipping away unseen. It was a blend of local expertise and improvised courage, with no one fully certain that their plans would work. But hesitation was a luxury the situation did not allow. Jews waiting to depart were guided from one hiding place to another, often at the last minute, when news arrived that patrols were shifting or that a boat had been delayed. In some cases, entire families moved through back gardens, ducked behind hedges, and paused behind sheds when headlights swept the road. Children were instructed to hold onto their parents' hands and stay completely silent, even if fear or cold overwhelmed them. Babies were the most challenging to protect, their cries could give everything away. Danish women prepared soft cloths, special swaddles, and small pouches of sugar water to soothe infants at crucial moments. When families reached the beaches or harbor edges, the atmosphere grew even more intense. The moonlight on the waves revealed the outlines of German patrol boats in the distance, silent, dark shapes that moved unpredictably. The fishermen's small wooden boats, sometimes no longer than 7 or 8 meters, bobbed gently near the shore. They were never meant to carry more than a handful of people, yet tonight they would be expected to hold many more, pressing the limits of both balance and safety. As passengers approached, the fishermen whispered quick instructions: where to sit, how to distribute weight, what to do if they spotted a German vessel, and how to stay quiet should a patrol searchlight sweep across the water. Once the boats pushed off from the shore, a new kind of fear emerged, one that mixed with hope and carried an almost physical weight. The sea, usually a friend to those who lived by it, could turn treacherous without warning. Waves slapped the wooden hulls, lanterns were extinguished to avoid detection, and the only sounds were the creaking of wood, the rhythmic pull of oars, and the muffled breathing of people who understood that discovery meant death or imprisonment. Some boats had engines, but the fishermen did not always dare to start them until they were far enough out that the noise wouldn't travel back to German ears. Rowing across the strait required strength and calm, both of which were often tested as winds picked up or fog rolled across the waters. One fisherman later described how the passengers' silence was unlike any he had ever heard, a silence heavy with desperation and faith, a silence so deep it seemed to swallow the sound of the waves. Many people prayed quietly, gripping the edges of the boat until their knuckles turned white. Some stared at the dark horizon, imagining the Swedish coast even before it became visible. Others, especially older passengers, trembled not only from cold but from the memory of what they had fled and the fear of what might still lie ahead. For some, the journey felt like a fragile thread between life and death. Not every crossing went smoothly. There were moments when German patrol boats passed dangerously close, their engines thundering across the water. Fishermen sometimes cut their engines immediately, ordering everyone to crouch low and stay still as the searchlight beams schemed across the waves. A few boats had to drift silently for minutes that felt like hours until the danger passed. In other cases, mechanical problems forced fishermen to improvise repairs in the dark, tightening bolts or clearing clogged fuel lines without making a sound. And then there were the natural threats: sudden gusts of wind, unpredictable tides, and occasionally thick fog that could disorient even the most experienced sailors. Despite these dangers, most crossings succeeded. When the first faint outline of Swedish land finally came into view, murmurs of relief spread across the boats, some passengers weeping quietly, others gripping each other in disbelief. Swedish coastal guards often appeared to escort the boats through the last stretch, signaling the end of fear and the beginning of safety. Once they reached the shore, the refugees were brought to temporary shelters, given blankets, warm food, and assistance with registering their arrival. Many broke down the moment they stepped onto Swedish soil, not because they felt weak but because the enormity of surviving such a journey finally overwhelmed them. Back in Denmark, the work never paused. The moment one boat returned, preparations began for the next voyage. Fishermen slept in short intervals, sometimes only an hour or two, before heading out again. Families continued to guide new groups of Jews to the coast, adjusting their routes to avoid fresh German checkpoints. Resistance members monitored German movements through coded messages, passing updated information to boat crews to ensure they had the best chance of avoiding capture. Each night brought new challenges, yet each night also brought more people safely to Sweden. What made the operation extraordinary was not only the scale or the danger but the shared purpose that united people who had never imagined they would one day become part of a clandestine rescue mission. Shopkeepers who had never broken a rule now acted as couriers. Elderly couples who had lived quiet lives now sheltered entire families under their roofs. Fishermen who normally worried only about weather patterns now navigated political and military risks with astonishing bravery. Every rescued life was a small victory, and these victories accumulated, slowly shaping a narrative that defied the brutality spreading across Europe. By the end of those first intense days of sea crossings, the Danish coast had become a symbol of defiance not through weapons or battles but through compassion and coordinated courage. Germany still held control of Denmark on paper, but along the shoreline, something far more powerful was happening. A nation was protecting its most vulnerable citizens with an unshakable determination that even occupation could not crush. The outcome, and a nation that refused to look away. 1085 words. As the rescue operation entered its final stretch in early October, an overwhelming mixture of exhaustion and determination settled upon everyone involved. The Danish coastline, which had become a silent artery of escape, was still alive with hurried footsteps, whispered instructions, and the quiet churn of boats that carried their precious passengers toward freedom. Yet by now the Germans had begun to sense that something unusual was unfolding. Patrols increased along roads leading to coastal villages, officers demanded identification papers more aggressively, and checkpoints that had once been cursory were now conducted with sharp suspicion. Even so, the Danes remained astonishingly composed. They understood the stakes, and no matter how dangerous the atmosphere became, their commitment did not waver. In cities farther inland, the mood was thick with a strange kind of anticipation. Many Danish citizens who were not directly involved in the escape still felt as though they were part of a larger moral undertaking. People watched windows late into the night, listening for signals or footsteps that might indicate someone needed help. They kept radios hidden under floorboards, turning the volume low enough so the sound wouldn't travel through walls. News from coastal towns arrived through a patchwork of informal messengers, bicycle couriers, sympathetic police officers, and medical staff who moved quietly between safe houses. Each update carried immense weight. A group had reached the water safely, or a boat had been stopped by patrols, or a family had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only speculation and fear. The arrests that the Germans had planned for October 1 did begin, but they unfolded in a way no one in the Nazi command had expected. When soldiers arrived at Jewish homes, they often found empty rooms, beds hastily made, drawers left open, and wardrobes cleared of clothing. Some apartments looked as though families had stepped out only moments before, while others were stripped of everything, their occupants long gone. German reports described the situation with confusion and irritation. Entire streets of Jewish residences had emptied before troops arrived. The Nazis, accustomed to swift and brutal success, were forced to confront an unforeseen and humiliating reality. An entire population had acted faster and more cohesively than their carefully coordinated plan. Still, the danger had not passed. Some Jews were caught while trying to reach safe houses, others were arrested in rural areas where communication lagged. A few boats were intercepted, leading to frantic attempts by passengers to hide in cabins or jump into the frigid water. Arrested families were sent first to a temporary camp within Denmark and later to the Theresienstadt ghetto in occupied Czechoslovakia. Yet even here, the Danish government, though dismantled, exerted whatever influence it could. Danish officials repeatedly demanded information about their deported citizens, sent food parcels, and insisted on access to the prisoners, forcing the Nazis to treat Danish Jews less harshly than Jews from other countries. It was not salvation, but it was humanity exerting itself in a place designed to crush it. Back in Denmark, the rescue work continued until nearly every reachable Jewish family had fled or found safe hiding. Fishermen ventured out as long as the waters remained passable. Some made the crossing dozens of times, each journey eroding their energy but strengthening their resolve. Volunteers who had spent days moving families from one location to another now found themselves weeping from both relief and exhaustion as the final groups departed. In quiet homes, people returned borrowed blankets, folded up makeshift beds, and removed boards from basement hideouts, unsure whether the war would bring even greater challenges in the future but grateful that they had done what conscience demanded. When the major wave of escapes had finally passed, the Danish people slowly began to comprehend the magnitude of what they had accomplished. Around 7,200 Jews, along with several hundred non-Jewish relatives, had escaped to Sweden. The number was so high that even members of the resistance were astonished. Many had expected far greater losses, especially given the speed of the German order and the limited time for preparation. But the unity of the population, ordinary citizens acting without orders, often without sleep, relying only on moral instinct, had transformed a moment of terror into one of the most successful rescue operations in modern history. Life under occupation did not become easier afterward. The Germans grew increasingly suspicious of the Danes and punished acts of resistance more harshly. Sabotage escalated, leading to reprisals that cost innocent lives. Denunciations became more common as some desperate or opportunistic individuals tried to curry favor with the occupiers. Yet despite the mounting pressure, the Danish spirit remained intact. People continued to smuggle information, hide resistance fighters, and sabotage industries working for Germany. The memory of what they had done for their Jewish neighbors became a quiet source of moral strength. Meanwhile, in Sweden, the refugees rebuilt their lives as best they could. Swedish families, churches, and aid organizations stepped forward to offer housing, schooling, and medical care. Children began attending Swedish schools, learning a new language even as they clung to memories of their escape. Adults found work in factories, shops, and hospitals. Though many were weighed down by the uncertainty of the war and the fear of those left behind, they were alive, and that fact alone made their new hardships endurable. For some, the moment they stepped onto Swedish soil remained etched in their memories for the rest of their lives: the sudden rush of relief, the warmth of blankets handed to them, and the realization that the nightmare had been left behind on the opposite shore. When the war finally ended in 1945, the returning Danish Jews came home to a country that had safeguarded not only their lives but their dignity. Neighbors had watched their houses, tended their gardens, and kept their belongings safe. Many apartments were found exactly as they had been left, with furniture covered neatly and valuables protected by those who had refused to let strangers plunder them. Children returned to find their drawings still pinned to walls. Couples found wedding gifts waiting on shelves. It was as though the country had held its breath for 2 years, preserving everything until its absent citizens could return. In the aftermath, historians, diplomats, and survivors tried to understand how such a small nation, under the control of one of the most powerful regimes in history, had managed an operation of such scale and coordination. The answer, many concluded, was not rooted in military strength or political strategy but in a deeply ingrained sense of community. Danes did not see their Jewish neighbors as outsiders, they saw them as fellow citizens whose lives deserved protection. And in a world where cruelty had become systematic, Denmark's refusal to look away stood out as a rare, shining example of collective moral courage. Today, the story of Denmark's rescue of the Jews remains one of the most remarkable chapters of World War II. It demonstrates that even in the darkest of times, ordinary people, fishermen, teachers, doctors, shopkeepers, families can rise together to defy violence and protect the vulnerable. The Danes did not simply save thousands of lives, they proved that compassion, when shared widely enough, can become a form of resistance stronger than any army.